All right. So this in this section, we're going to talk about a second type of experimental evidence for discrimination. It's called correspondence test. Okay, so correspondence test, this refers to they're having correspondence either on paper or it'll be usually it's either paper or internet. These days, it's almost all internet, and they're having correspondence with the employer, and they're seeing if the employer, or sometimes it's been done with other things besides employers, and seeing if they treat people differently. Okay, so they create fictitious applicants, so they don't have to have real people. That's an advantage of this technique. And they're not going to have a direct face-to-face interaction in most cases. And then they vary only the race or the gender or some other characteristic of the applicant. Okay, so it's just going to be on paper. They use these fictitious applicants to answer job advertisements via email, via mail or internet. And one of the strengths of this is these correspondence studies have allowed researchers to apply to more higher level jobs in some cases, in some types of research. And that wouldn't be a face-to-face kind of application process. Okay, so this, and especially more and more as more job search has gone online, this allowed them to respond to that. Okay, so if the employers respond differently to applicants based on the race or gender, this would be pretty strong evidence of discrimination. And it actually eliminates some of those problems that were mentioned in the audit study because you don't have to worry about people's behavior. Because there's no people. So as long as there's nothing secretly that you're tipping off in your resume that you don't mean to, really the only difference is race or gender, and that should then be a clear evidence that there's discrimination going on. So the only problem is this type of study is a little difficult to do in countries where there's strong anti-discrimination rules. And that's because in those countries, it's usually discouraged for the applicants to put in personal information, such as their race, their gender, their marital status, their age, or their photograph on applications. And employers are not legally supposed to use any of those factors in deciding who to hire, and you're just strongly discouraged from putting them on. In fact, in some job applications, they will explicitly tell you if you put certain information, we will get rid of your application. Do not put photos, etc. And so now this information is collected by HR offices as part of the job application process to look at diversity issues, but that information is kept separate from the job application that is seen by the hiring committee in most cases. Okay, so some of you may know about that. So how do you do it if you're not supposed to put your race on your resume or in your cover letter? Then how do they let the firms know the race of the people so they can see if they're discriminating? Okay, so a very famous paper that was published in the American Economics Review in 2003 is, are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal? Okay, this is a very famous paper that then led to a whole bunch of other papers being published. So this innovative study used the fact that in the US, certain names are racially identifiable, at least are associated with a specific race. Okay, and so they could use this fact to then test if there is racial discrimination going on. So certain names are more associated with one race than another, and they could use this fact. So they get identical resumes, and the only difference was whether the name was a so-called white name or so-called black name. Now, how did they come up with the list of names? They came up with the list of names by looking at birth records, and so they picked the white names they picked were so-called white names were names which had a very, 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 very high percentage of the people with that name were white. And same thing with the names that they picked as so-called black names, a very, very high percentage of people with that name were black. They also tested these names to see if people actually recognized that. So they tested them on people to see, and fairly accurately, most people, when they saw the names, they said, yes, I would suspect that person is white, or I suspect that person is black. Okay, so they did get names that the employer is going to recognize and is going to associate with a racial group. And this study found a very substantial difference in response based on whether the person had a white or a black name. And so whites were much more likely to get callbacks on jobs, quite a bit more likely. I believe it was, if we'll look at the data in a second, but I believe it was 50% more likely. Um, Now, one of the criticisms this paper got was people said, well, maybe the employer is not responding to, and this is kind of the standard criticism for anything about just racial discrimination. And they said maybe the employer is not responding to race, they're responding to social class. So maybe the names are not so much associated with race as they're associated with lower socioeconomic class. And so the researchers said, okay, let's test that. So before they finished their research, they went back and tested that. So what they did was they got a new list of names. And so they got a list of names that were associated with lower socioeconomic class whites. And they got another list of names that were typically given by higher socioeconomic class African Americans. And they tested those names. So then again, they're eliminating the effect of social class, and the result was basically exactly the same. Okay, so it seemed quite clear that this was not a result of some kind of measure of social class, and it was strictly a measure um, of racial bias. Okay, that was quite clear in their paper, and that's part of the reason their paper became so well known. Not only was it innovative, but it also was very clear. So there's some limit to this method. The big limit is that this is only for the screening process of employment. You don't have real people, so you can't go do the interviews and get the offers, right? You're just doing the very beginning part of the process. But still, it does provide compelling evidence of this existing. So let's look at the Right, so let's look at the raw data from this paper, okay? And so what this is showing you the percent callback for white names and the percent callback for African American names, right? And so the percentages the callback percentages are pretty low because of, so I guess it indicates it wasn't that easy to find a job, but the key difference is they are not the same. So for the ratio is comparing the white names callback rate to the African American names. And so the 1.5 means that the white names were 50% more likely to get a callback. Now, one thing that is interesting here, and this was the same for men as it was for women. One thing that's interesting here is right here, okay? And that is there for women only, not for men. There was a difference for specific types of jobs. So for administrative jobs, black women were less likely to get a callback. Even there was the white women, sorry, got 60% more callbacks, right? So the gap was bigger for administrative jobs, and for sales jobs, the gap was much smaller. So it seemed to also be there was some particular bigger bias in certain fields than in other fields. And what you see on the right-hand side, this p-value, that just shows that these are statistically significant differences. Okay, so this is related to whether or not these differences between the callbacks are statistically significant, and it's that there is actually appears to be a difference between the two groups. Okay, so anyways, this was pretty strong evidence of clear of racial bias in hiring practice. So I just want to look at a few other research results because these correspondence studies have been done and done and done like crazy. I just want to mention a few others as well. So Gaddis in 2015 uses the same basic strategy, racial identifiable names on resumes and matched pairs that differ mainly by race. But then he also includes college selectivity and major and GPA as variables. So he also selectively varies those to look, and this is looking at jobs that require college education to try to see if not only is there a racial difference in callback, but how does the racial payoff for going to elite schools differ by race, okay? So before we get into that, I just want to mention that he did not find any significant difference in gender. Okay, so there was no significant difference in gender in callback. That was one thing. Secondly, as expected, people who went to more elite schools got better responses. People with higher GPAs got better responses. And the two majors that he tested were economics and psychology. And people with economics degrees got higher callbacks rates. Okay, higher positive responses. Now, so those were kind of all as expected from previous research. What he found that was interesting is that there was quite a big difference in race. Okay, so and this was not completely mitigated by going to elite schools. Okay, so the white applicants from selective schools got quite a lot higher response rates than black applicants from elite schools. And in fact, the white applicants from less selective colleges were actually fairly similar. As you can see, this is in the chart on the right, as you to the response rates for black applicants. They were not statistically distinguishable. Neither were the other either. Then the really big one was that black applicants from less selective schools were much less likely to get callbacks. Okay, the black applicants from less selective schools were much less likely to get callbacks. So again, this paper uses a different method and kind of gives a different time period. And he was applying wider. He wasn't just applying in 2 cities, but again finds results that are pretty consistent with the other ones that we've seen. And actually the results that I've seen for racial discrimination, especially with African Americans, are pretty consistent over time and different levels. There's not actually big differences or big changes, big improvements in the studies that I've seen that date back at least to the 1990s.